"Can you walk me home? He's following me," she asked. Hell's Angel said, "I'll solve that permanently." The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Jessie wiped down another table at Joe's diner. Her movements were mechanical, practiced from years of the same routine, but her eyes never stayed fixed in one place for too long. They darted from the windows to the door, then to the few customers scattered around the dining room. An elderly couple sat in the corner booth, sharing a slice of apple pie. Near the counter, a truck driver nursed his third cup of coffee, and at table 7, a teenager picked at his late-night breakfast, his textbook spread out around his plate. Jessie's hands trembled slightly as she sprayed cleaner on the sticky surface. The feeling of being watched had become as familiar as her own reflection, a constant companion she never wanted. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, but she found herself wishing it was down, if only to hide her face a little better. "You okay there, honey?" Martha the cook called from behind the counter, her weathered face creased with concern as she watched Jessie jump at the sound of her voice. "I'm fine," Jessie answered, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She tucked the cleaning spray into her apron pocket and grabbed a fresh stack of napkins from the counter. The bell above the door chimed, and Jessie's shoulders tensed. She turned, relief washing over her when she saw it was just Mr. Peterson coming in for his usual late-night coffee and toast. He gave her a friendly nod as he settled into his regular spot by the window. As she worked, Jessie's mind wandered to the growing collection of notes she'd found slipped under her apartment door. The latest one had appeared just this morning. "You look beautiful when you sleep." The words made her stomach turn. She'd doubled the locks on her doors and windows, but it didn't help her feel any safer. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. The hours crept by slowly. Jessie kept busy, refilling coffee cups and taking orders, all while watching the shadows that moved past the diner's large windows. Each time the bell rang, her heart would race until she could see who had entered. Finally, it was closing time. Jessie counted her tips with shaking hands. Decent money tonight, at least. She hung up her apron and grabbed her worn denim jacket from the break room hook. "You want me to walk you out?" Martha offered, concern evident in her voice. "No thanks," Jessie replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'll be fine. It's just a few blocks." The night air was crisp as Jessie stepped outside. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and fumbled with the diner's keys, her fingers clumsy as she locked the door. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the buzzing of the broken streetlight across the road. That's when she saw it. A shadow moving in her peripheral vision. Her heart began to pound as she recognized the familiar silhouette. Tom. He was standing near the alley, watching her. Even in the dim light, she could make out his disheveled appearance and the intensity of his stare. Jessie's legs felt like lead as she started walking, her steps quickening with each passing moment. The sound of footsteps behind her confirmed her fears. He was following her. Each step echoed on the empty sidewalk, a haunting rhythm that matched her racing pulse. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized she was alone with her stalker on the dark, empty street. The streetlights cast long shadows on the empty sidewalk as Jessie hurried around the corner, her worn sneakers slapping against the concrete. Her heart hammered in her chest, keeping time with the steady footsteps that followed behind her. Tom's footsteps. She didn't need to look back to know it was him. She'd memorized the sound of his walk over the past few weeks. The businesses along this stretch were mostly closed for the night, their dark windows reflecting her hurried movement like funhouse mirrors. A neon open sign buzzed from the Blackjack bar, its red glow painting the sidewalk in patches of crimson. The sound of muffled music and voices leaked out onto the street. Jessie's hands clutched her purse closer to her body. Her throat felt tight, making each breath shorter than the last. Sweat dampened the back of her uniform despite the cool night air. The footsteps behind her grew closer, more deliberate. That's when she saw him. Garth the Bear Callahan sat on the concrete steps of the Blackjack, his massive frame taking up most of the space. His leather vest displayed the distinctive Hell's Angels patches, worn but well-maintained. A half-empty beer bottle dangled from his fingers as he stared out at the street, lost in thought. Everyone in town knew about Garth. He was impossible to miss, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders like a linebacker, his graying beard and weathered face telling stories of a hard life lived. Some people crossed the street when they saw him coming. Others whispered about his connections to the motorcycle club, but Jesse had served him coffee at the diner enough times to notice how he always said, "Please," and "Thank you," how he left generous tips, how his eyes carried a sadness that seemed permanent. Tom's footsteps grew even closer. Jesse could almost feel his presence now, like a dark cloud hovering just behind her. Her mind raced through her options. There were no open stores, no crowds to lose herself in, no safe places to hide. Her feet stopped moving before her brain made the conscious decision. Garth looked up as her shadow fell across him, his dark eyes sharp and alert despite the late hour and the beer in his hand. Up close, his size was even more impressive, the streetlight catching the silver in his beard and the edges of his tattoos. Jesse's voice came out in a whisper, shaky but urgent. "Can you walk me home? He's following me." The words tumbled out before she could second-guess them, before her fear of this intimidating man could override her terror of Tom. Garth's eyes flicked past her, taking in the situation with one quick glance. Without a word, he set his beer down on the step and rose to his full height. The movement was surprisingly fluid for such a large man. He stepped down onto the street, positioning himself slightly in front of Jesse, his broad frame creating a protective shadow that enveloped her completely. "I'll solve that permanently," he said, his voice a low rumble that matched his nickname. He began walking, and Jesse fell into step beside him, feeling the weight of his presence like a shield. The street stretched out before them like a dark ribbon, punctuated by pools of yellow light from scattered street lamps. Jesse walked close to Garth, his massive frame making her feel like a small boat in the lee of a mountain. The leather of his vest creaked softly with each step, mixing with the quiet tap of their footsteps on the concrete. Every few moments Jessie glanced behind them, her neck prickling with the memory of being followed. But Tom's footsteps had faded away the moment Garth had stepped up beside her. The night felt different now, less threatening, though her hands still trembled slightly. "You don't need to keep looking back," Garth said, his voice low and gravelly. "He won't try anything while I'm here." Jessie nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "I know. It's just become a habit, I guess. Always checking." They passed the closed storefronts of Main Street, their reflections ghosting along in the darkened windows. A cat darted across their path, making Jessie jump. Garth's hand instinctively moved to steady her, but he pulled it back before making contact. "How long has he been following you?" Garth asked, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead of them. "A few weeks." Jessie's voice came out barely above a whisper. "At first, I thought I was imagining things. He'd just be there. At the diner, across the street from my apartment, at the grocery store." She shuddered. "It got worse after I told him to leave me alone." Garth's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. Men like that, they don't understand the word no. They turned onto Cedar Street, where old maple trees created a tunnel of branches overhead. Jessie's apartment building stood halfway down the block, a 3-story brick structure with window boxes full of wilting flowers. "That's my building," Jessie said, pointing ahead. "The 2nd floor." Garth nodded, his eyes methodically sweeping the area as they approached. The security light above the entrance flickered erratically, creating dancing shadows on the building's facade. Jessie fumbled in her purse for her keys, the familiar jangle somehow reassuring. At the front door, she turned to face Garth. He towered over her, but rather than feeling intimidating, his presence felt protective. Like a shield against the darkness that had been stalking her. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. "I don't know what I would have done if—" Garth held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't mention it." His voice was gruff, but kind. He remained by the door as she unlocked it, his attention focused on their surroundings. The street remained empty and quiet. but he continued his vigilant watch. Jesse stepped inside the building's entrance, then paused, turning back to look at him. The flickering light cast shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the silver in his beard. "You're safe now," Garth said, his tone carrying a weight she couldn't quite decipher. Something in his eyes suggested this was more than just a random act of kindness, but before she could ask, his expression softened into a reassuring smile. Then he turned and walked away, his broad shoulders disappearing into the darkness of Cedar Street. Sunlight crept through Jessie's thin curtains, painting stripes across her unmade bed. She hadn't slept well, tossing and turning, replaying the previous night's events in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. Her alarm clock showed 6:45 a.m., and she knew she needed to get ready for her morning shift at the diner. In her tiny kitchen, Jessie's hands shook slightly as she measured coffee grounds into the filter. The familiar scent of brewing coffee filled the apartment, but it did little to calm her nerves. She leaned against the counter, running her fingers through her tangled hair while waiting for the coffee maker to finish its work. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, screen dark and silent. Jessie picked it up, her stomach tightening as she checked for messages. 3 missed calls from an unknown number made her heart skip a beat. Tom. It had to be him. She deleted the notifications without listening to the voicemails, her hands trembling as she set the phone back down. The coffee maker sputtered its last drops. Jessie poured herself a cup, adding a splash of cream. Steam curled up from the mug as she carried it to her small kitchen table by the window. Outside, the street was already alive with morning traffic. People heading to work, kids walking to school, all of them going about their normal lives. She envied their ordinary morning routines, unmarked by fear. Jessie's thoughts drifted to Garth. His intimidating presence had been like a shield last night, making her feel protected for the first time in weeks. It seemed surreal now in the morning light. A Hell's Angel biker walking her home, keeping her safe. She wondered if she'd see him again, or if last night had been a one-time act of kindness. After finishing her coffee, Jessie got ready for work. She chose her usual uniform, black pants, comfortable shoes, and her blue diner shirt with the name tag. In the bathroom mirror, dark circles under her eyes betrayed her restless night. She applied some concealer, trying to hide the evidence of her exhaustion. The walk to work felt different today. Jessie kept her head up, scanning the street with watchful eyes. Every person she passed made her tense up, wondering if it was Tom. A car horn honked somewhere behind her, making her jump. She quickened her pace, clutching her purse closer to her body. The diner was already busy when she arrived. The morning rush was in full swing. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the coffee maker, and the murmur of conversation filled the air. Jessie tied on her apron and got to work, falling into the familiar rhythm of taking orders and serving food. Throughout her shift, she kept glancing at the door whenever it chimed, half expecting to see Tom's face. But he never appeared. The hours ticked by normally, just another day at the diner. The routine of work helped steady her nerves, though she couldn't completely shake off her unease. As her shift ended, Jessie gathered her things from the break room. She pushed open the diner's front door, the evening air cool on her face. That's when she saw him, Garth, sitting astride his motorcycle across the street. His leather vest caught the last rays of sunlight, and his eyes were alert, watching the area. When he noticed her, he gave her a simple nod of acknowledgement. Something warm bloomed in Jessie's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Maybe she wasn't alone in this after all. The week settled into an unusual rhythm. Each evening, as Jessie locked up the diner, she'd spot Garth's motorcycle parked across the street. Sometimes he'd be reading a paperback novel, other times just sitting there watching the street with keen eyes. He never made a big show of following her home, just kept a respectful distance, his presence both reassuring and unobtrusive. At first, Jessie felt strange about having someone watch over her like this. She'd catch glimpses of his leather vest in store windows, or hear the low rumble of his bike idling at intersections. But as the days passed, the knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. For the first time in months, she could focus on her work without constantly looking over her shoulder. The diner's regular customers had noticed the change in her too. Her hands didn't shake anymore when she poured their coffee, and her smile came more easily. Even her boss commented that she seemed more like her old self. On Wednesday evening, when a sudden rainstorm hit, Garth appeared at the diner's door with an extra helmet. "Can't have you walking in this," he'd said simply. The ride home on his motorcycle had been surprisingly peaceful, the rain pattering against her borrowed helmet as they cruised through the quiet streets. By Friday, Jessie had grown used to their wordless routine. She'd wave to him when she spotted his bike, and he'd nod in return. Sometimes she wondered about his story. What made this tough-looking biker decide to become her protector? But she never asked, respecting the quiet understanding between them. The following Tuesday evening started like any other. Jessie wiped down the last table, her movements quick and efficient. The sky outside had turned a deep purple, streetlights flickering to life one by one. She could see Garth's familiar silhouette across the street, his broad shoulders hunched over his bike's handlebars. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, keys jingling in her hand, a figure emerged from the shadows beside the diner. Tom. His sudden appearance made her freeze mid-step. He looked different, disheveled, angry, his eyes wild with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "You've been avoiding me," Tom snarled, moving to block her path. His voice had an edge she'd never heard before. "We need to talk, Jessie. You can't keep ignoring me like this." Jessie took a step backward, her heart hammering in her chest. "Leave me alone, Tom," she managed to say, but her voice came out smaller than she intended. Tom moved closer, his face twisted with frustration. "No! You're going to listen to me!" He reached for her arm, but before he could touch her, a shadow fell over them both. Garth stood there, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire sidewalk. His expression was eerily calm, but his eyes blazed with warning. "Step away from her," he said, his voice low and steady. Tom's face reddened with anger. "This isn't any of your business," he spat, but there was a tremor in his voice. "I'm making it my business," Garth replied, taking a step forward. "If you don't get lost, I'll make you." Tom hesitated, his gaze darting between Garth and Jessie. Finally, he backed away, his hands raised in mock surrender. As he disappeared around the corner, Jessie let out a shaky breath, her nerves still jangling from the confrontation. The late-night crowd had thinned out, leaving just a few regulars nursing their coffees in the worn booths of the diner. Jessie's shift had ended 15 minutes ago, but instead of heading home, she found herself sitting across from Garth in what had become their usual spot, a corner booth away from the windows. Steam rose from their coffee cups, creating soft swirls in the fluorescent lighting. Jessie wrapped her hands around her mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. She'd grown used to Garth's presence over the past few weeks, his silent protection becoming a steady constant in her life. Yet she knew so little about him. The jukebox in the corner played an old country song, its melody mixing with the gentle clink of dishes from the kitchen. Jessie watched as Garth added a third packet of sugar to his coffee, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. "You know," she began, her voice soft but steady. "You've been watching out for me all this time, but I barely know anything about you." She stirred her coffee slowly, gathering courage. "Do you have family around here?" Garth's shoulders tensed, slightly. His fingers tightened around his cup, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic outside. "Not anymore," he finally said, his voice rough and low. He kept his eyes fixed on his coffee, as if reading something in its dark surface. Jessie noticed the way his jaw clenched, the slight shift in his posture. She recognized the signs of someone carrying heavy memories. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to pry." Garth shook his head slowly. "No need to apologize." He took a long sip of his coffee, then set the cup down carefully. His weathered hands rested on the table, and Jessie noticed a faded tattoo on his right wrist, a date she couldn't quite make out. The overhead lights buzzed softly as another customer left. the bell above the door chiming their departure. In the relative quiet, Garth's voice seemed even deeper when he spoke again. "I had a family once," he said, each word measured and heavy with meaning. "A wife named Sarah. A little girl, Amy." His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. "They were everything to me." Jesse sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might cause him to retreat back into silence. She watched as emotions played across his face, grief, anger, regret, before settling into a deep sadness she recognized all too well. "There was a man," Garth continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who became obsessed with Sarah. Someone like—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Jesse understood. Like Tom. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Jesse felt her heart ache for the pain she saw in his eyes, understanding now why he'd taken such an interest in her situation. Garth looked up then, meeting her gaze directly for the first time that evening. His eyes, usually hard and alert, held a vulnerability that surprised her. "I couldn't protect them," he said simply. Then, with quiet determination, he added, "I won't let that happen to you." The words settled over them like a promise, and Jessie felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She saw Garth in a new light now, not just as the intimidating biker who'd become her protector, but as someone who understood her fear on a deeply personal level. Jessie trudged up the stairs to her second-floor apartment, her feet heavy after another long shift at the diner. The hallway lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the worn carpet. She'd seen Garth watching from his usual spot across the street before she entered the building, and that knowledge gave her some comfort. At her door, she noticed something white peeking out from under it. Her heart skipped a beat as she bent down to pick up what looked like a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the messy handwriting that covered the page. "My dearest Jessie," the note began. Her stomach churned at the familiar way Tom addressed her. "You think that biker can protect you forever? He can't be there all the time. You belong with me, and I'll wait as long as it takes. You'll see we're meant to be together." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She fumbled with her keys, nearly dropping them before managing to unlock her door. Once inside, she slammed it shut and engaged all 3 locks, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. Jessie slid down against the door until she was sitting on the floor, the note crumpled in her fist. The walls of her small apartment seemed to press in around her. Even here, in what should have been her safe space, Tom had found a way to reach her. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, trying to make herself as small as possible. The ticking of her kitchen clock echoed in the silence, marking each second she sat there, paralyzed by fear. Every shadow, every creaking floorboard made her jump. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Jessie tossed and turned, Tom's words playing on repeat in her mind. He was right about one thing. Garth couldn't be there all the time. The thought sent another wave of panic through her. The next morning, Jessie's hands shook as she showed Garth the note during their usual coffee meeting. They sat in their corner booth, the morning sun streaming through the diner's windows, but she felt none of its warmth. "He left this under my door last night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She smoothed out the crumpled paper on the table between them. Garth's face darkened as he read the note, his jaw clenched tight, and his massive hands curled into fists on the table. When he looked up at her, his eyes were filled with a mix of anger and concern. "We'll handle this," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll make sure you're never alone. He won't get near you again." But even as Garth spoke these words, Jessie felt the weight of helplessness settling over her. Tom was getting bolder, more aggressive. If he could get to her apartment, what else might he do? She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling that had started deep in her chest. "He's not going to stop," she whispered, staring down at her untouched coffee. "He's just going to keep coming after me, and there's nothing I can do about it." Garth reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. The gesture was meant to be reassuring. but Jessie couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped in a nightmare that was only getting worse. Despite the protection Garth offered, despite his promises, Tom's presence loomed larger than ever, casting a dark shadow over every moment of her day. The morning sun streamed through Jessie's apartment windows, but it brought her no warmth. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the growing pile of letters from Tom, each one more possessive than the last, each one making her feel smaller, more trapped. Her hands shook as she picked up her coffee mug. Dark circles lined her eyes from another sleepless night. The caffeine barely touched her exhaustion anymore. She glanced at her phone, another hour before her shift started at the diner. During her shift, Jessie's movements were mechanical. Pour coffee, take orders. Smile, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, where she caught glimpses of Tom. He wasn't even trying to hide anymore. He'd sit in his car across the street, or lean against a lamppost, watching. Always watching. "Can I get some more coffee?" A customer's voice made her jump, nearly dropping the pot she was holding. "Of course, sorry," she mumbled, her cheeks flushing. Her hands trembled as she poured, spilling a few drops on the table. "You okay, honey?" the elderly woman asked, concern etching her weathered face. Jessie managed a weak smile and nodded, quickly moving away. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. Tom had a way of getting to people, manipulating them. Last week, she'd discovered he'd been asking her coworkers about her schedule, pretending to be an old friend. The bell above the door chimed, and Jessie's heart rate spiked until she saw it was Garth. His massive frame filled the doorway, and for a moment she felt safer. He took his usual seat at the counter, his eyes scanning the diner before settling on her. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for a coffee cup. Garth nodded, but his expression was serious. "We need to talk, Jessie. This can't go on." She poured his coffee with unsteady hands. "I'm fine," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. "No, you're not." His voice was gentle, but firm. "I see how you jump at every sound, how you're always looking over your shoulder. And I know about the letters." Jessie froze. "How did you—" "I've been watching. He's getting bolder, leaving them almost daily now." Garth leaned forward, his voice low. "You need to take legal action. Get a restraining order, at least. I know a good lawyer who can help." The thought made Jessie's stomach churn. "I can't," she said, her voice barely audible. "If I do that, he'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "He'll what? Get angry?" Garth's eyes softened. "He's already angry, Jessie. Already dangerous. At least with legal protection, you'll have the law on your side." Jessie wiped down the counter, needing to keep her hands busy. Through the window, she caught another glimpse of Tom's car. Her chest tightened. What if it makes things worse? What if he retaliates? "That's why you've got me," Garth said firmly. "And the law. And people who care about you. You don't have to face this alone." Jessie's eyes welled with tears. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hope there was a way out of this nightmare. But the fear had its hooks in deep. The idea of confronting Tom, even through legal channels, made her feel sick with anxiety. I need time to think about it," she managed, her voice shaky. Garth nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Take the time you need. But don't take too long. I'm here, when you're ready." The neon sign of Jerry's Diner flickered in the darkness, casting alternating shadows across the empty street. Jessie's fingers fumbled with her keys as she locked the front door, her breath creating small clouds in the chilly night air. She pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off both the cold and her growing unease. As she turned to leave, her heart stopped. There he was. Tom stood perfectly still across the street, his figure illuminated by the harsh glow of a streetlight. His eyes bore into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Unlike before, he wasn't pretending to be casual or trying to hide his presence. He just stood there. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band pulled too tight. Jessie couldn't move. Her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot by fear and something else. Anger, maybe, or frustration at her own helplessness. The street was deserted except for the two of them, the usual comfort of passing cars and pedestrians notably absent. Tom's face held an expression she'd never seen before. It wasn't the fake friendliness he usually wore, or even the anger he'd shown when confronted. Instead, there was something calculating in his gaze, as if he were solving a puzzle only he could see. Jessie's hand crept toward her phone in her pocket. The weight of it offered little comfort. Who would she call? The police would take too long to arrive, and Tom hadn't actually done anything yet. He was just standing there, watching, waiting. The silence pressed against her eardrums. Even the usual distant sound of traffic seemed muted, as if the world had stopped to watch this moment unfold. Jessie could hear her own heartbeat, too fast and too loud in her chest. She took a hesitant step backward, her shoe scraping against the concrete. The sound seemed to echo in the empty street. Tom didn't move, but his lips curled into something that might have been a smile. A bead of sweat rolled down Jessie's back despite the cold. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a rabbit caught in an open field. Her breaths came in short, sharp bursts. The distance between them, maybe 30 feet, felt both too far and not far enough. The roar of a motorcycle engine shattered the silence. Jessie knew that sound now, recognized the particular rumble of Garth's bike. Relief flooded through her body as the massive figure of the biker appeared, seemingly materializing out of nowhere. Garth didn't park his bike. He simply stopped it in the middle of the street, positioning himself squarely between Jessie and Tom. His leather vest creaked as he crossed his arms, his presence filling the space like a mountain suddenly sprouting from the pavement. "Leave." Garth's voice was low, but carried clearly across the street. It wasn't a request. Tom's expression flickered. For the first time since Jessie had known him, he looked uncertain. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. Jessie's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the diner's door handle to steady herself, shame washing over her. Why couldn't she have told Tom to leave herself? Why did she need someone else to fight her battles? The relief of Tom's departure mixed with a bitter taste in her mouth, the taste of her own perceived weakness. The law office of Morrison and Associates occupied a small brick building downtown, wedged between a coffee shop and a bookstore. Jessie sat rigid in one of the leather chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The waiting room smelled of lemon furniture polish and old paper. Garth's large frame filled the chair next to her, his leather vest creaking softly whenever he moved. He'd cleaned up for the meeting. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his usual bandana was absent. Still, his presence drew curious glances from the receptionist. "You're doing the right thing," Garth said quietly, noticing how she kept wringing her hands. Jessie nodded but couldn't find her voice. The thought of officially documenting everything made her stomach churn. It meant admitting how bad things had gotten, how much control Tom had over her life. "Ms. Harper?" A woman in her 40s appeared in the doorway, wearing a crisp navy suit. "I'm Sarah Morrison. Please come in." The office was warm and welcoming, with soft yellow walls and framed photographs of local landscapes. Sarah's desk was neat but lived in, with stacks of papers arranged in tidy piles. "Tell me what's been happening," Sarah said, her voice gentle but professional as she opened a leather-bound notebook. Jessie's voice trembled as she began. "It started about 2 months ago." She described the progression, the casual encounters that became too frequent, the notes in her mailbox, the way Tom would appear wherever she went. With each detail, her voice grew stronger, as if finally speaking the words aloud was lifting a weight from her shoulders. Garth sat silently beside her, but his presence gave her strength. When she faltered, describing the most recent incident at the diner, he leaned forward slightly, and somehow that small gesture helped her continue. Sarah took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Do you have any of the notes he sent?" she asked. Jessie pulled out a manila envelope from her purse. She'd saved everything, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe some part of her had known it would come to this. "This is more than enough for a restraining order," Sarah said, reviewing the evidence. "We can file the paperwork today. However," she looked at Jessie directly, "you need to be prepared. Sometimes filing for protection can escalate the situation temporarily." Jessie's hands began trembling again. Sarah noticed and added quickly, "That's why it's good you have support." She glanced at Garth appreciatively. "The important thing is to document everything and call the police immediately if he violates the order once it's in place." They spent the next hour filling out paperwork, Jessie's hand cramping as she detailed dates and incidents. When they finally finished, Sarah assured them she would file everything immediately. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Garth pulled his keys from his pocket. "Come on," he said. "I'll drive you home." Jessie hesitated, looking at his motorcycle. She'd never ridden one before, and after the emotional drain of the afternoon, she wasn't sure she was ready for another first. "It's safer than walking," Garth said simply, holding out a spare helmet. Jessie took a deep breath and reached for the helmet. He was right. Everything was different now. Her old routines, her sense of security, even her daily walk home. Tom had changed it all. But maybe, just maybe, these changes would lead to something better. The morning sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Jessie and Garth sat in their usual booth, coffee cups steaming between them. It had become their morning ritual, meeting before her shift started, sharing quiet conversations over breakfast. Today was different. Garth's eyes held a distant look as he stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic mug. His leather vest hung loosely on the back of his chair, revealing faded tattoos on his arms. "Sarah was her name," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife. And our little girl was called Emily." His fingers tightened around the coffee cup. Emily had just turned 6. Jessie's heart tightened in her chest. She remained silent, giving him space to continue. "We had a good life, you know. Simple, but good. I worked construction back then." He pulled out his wallet, weathered and worn, and carefully extracted a creased photograph. "This was taken a month before." Jessie looked at the image. A younger Garth smiled back at her, clean-shaven and wearing regular clothes. A pretty woman with auburn hair leaned against him, holding a little girl with pigtails and missing front teeth. "He started showing up everywhere," Garth continued, his voice growing hoarse. "Following Sarah to the grocery store, waiting outside Emily's school. We filed police reports, got restraining orders, did everything by the book." His jaw clenched. It wasn't enough. Jessie reached across the table, hesitantly placing her hand on his forearm. His skin was warm under her touch. "One night, I was working late. Sarah called, scared, because someone was trying to break in." Garth's eyes glazed over with unshed tears. "By the time I got home..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The diner's usual morning sounds faded into the background. The clink of dishes, the murmur of conversations, the sizzle of the grill, all seemed distant and unreal. "That's when I joined the Angels," he said, his voice steadying. "They gave me purpose when I had nothing left. Taught me to be strong, to protect others." He looked directly at Jessie. "When I saw you that night, being followed by Tom, I saw Sarah all over again. I couldn't..." He shook his head. "I couldn't let it happen to someone else." "Garth, I'm so sorry," Jessie whispered, feeling the weight of his loss. He carefully tucked the photo back into his wallet. "Tom's not going to stop, Jessie. Men like him, they're obsessed. They think they own you." His eyes softened with concern. "But you're not alone in this. Not anymore." Jessie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Everything made sense now. His constant vigilance, his fierce protectiveness, the pain she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. She understood why this rough, imposing man had chosen to help her that night. "Thank you," she said softly. For telling me. For everything. Garth nodded, a gentle understanding passing between them. In that moment, Jessie felt safer than she had in months. Not just because of Garth's physical presence, but because she knew he truly understood her fear. He had lived through her nightmare, and worse. His pain had turned him into a protector, and now she was under his wing. The morning light grew stronger, warming the diner. Other customers came and went, but Jessie and Garth remained in their booth, sharing the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand each other. Jessie's hands shook as she arranged sugar packets in their metal holder. Something had been bothering her all morning. Little things that didn't add up. Tom seemed to know her schedule changes before she made them. He appeared at places she hadn't told anyone about. The diner hummed with the usual breakfast crowd. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air as Jessie watched her coworker Marie chatting with customers at the counter. Marie, who had always been so kind to her, who always wanted to know her plans, who always asked about her schedule changes. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. The sugar packets scattered across the counter as Jessie's hands went limp. Marie glanced over, concern crossing her face, but now Jessie saw through it, saw the guilt hidden behind those worried eyes. "You okay, hun?" Marie called out, walking over with a pot of coffee. Jessie stepped back, her throat tight. "How long?" she whispered. Marie froze, the coffee pot hovering mid-air. "What do you mean?" "How long have you been telling him about me?" Jessie's voice cracked. Other customers turned to look, but she didn't care anymore. "About my schedule? About where I go?" The coffee pot clattered against the counter as Marie set it down, her face draining of color. "Jessie, please, I can explain." "Explain what?" Jessie's voice rose. "Explain how you helped him stalk me? How you put me in danger?" Tears welled up in Marie's eyes. "He wouldn't leave me alone. He kept coming by my house, threatening to hurt my kids if I didn't help him." She wrung her hands in her apron. I didn't know what else to do. The diner had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now, but the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Jessie felt sick to her stomach. This woman she'd trusted, whom she'd considered a friend, had betrayed her. "You could have told me," Jessie said, her voice barely audible. "We could have faced him together." Marie reached out, but Jessie stepped back. "I was scared," Marie whispered. "I'm so sorry, Jessie. I'm so sorry." Jessie grabbed her purse from under the counter. She couldn't stay here, couldn't look at Marie's face anymore. She pushed through the diner's door, the bell jingling harshly above her. Outside, she fumbled with her phone, dialing Garth's number with trembling fingers. He answered on the first ring. "Marie's been helping him," she choked out. "All this time, she's been telling him everything about me." Garth's silence on the other end was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." True to his word, Garth's motorcycle roared up to the diner minutes later. His face was like thunder as Jessie told him everything. His hands gripped the handlebars of his parked bike so hard his knuckles turned white. "This ends now," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I won't let him terrorize anyone else. We're going to put a stop to this, Jessie. Once and for all." Jessie nodded, feeling both broken and somehow stronger. The betrayal cut deep, but having Garth beside her made her feel less alone. She watched as he pulled out his phone, his jaw set in determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the motorcycle club as Garth paced back and forth. 3 of his most trusted brothers sat on their bikes, listening intently as he laid out his thoughts. Their leather vests gleamed in the early light, patches and pins catching the sun. "We need to handle this carefully," Garth said, his voice low and measured. "No weapons, no permanent damage, just enough to make sure he gets the message." Snake, the oldest of the 3, nodded slowly. "What's the plan, Bear?" Garth ran a hand through his graying beard. "We corner him away from public view. Make it clear what happens if he keeps stalking her." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "But we do this my way, clean and controlled." The rumble of another motorcycle drew their attention. Jessie pulled up on her small scooter, her work uniform visible under her light jacket. Her face was pale, and dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "You didn't have to come," Garth said softly as she approached. "Yes, I did." Jessie hugged herself, looking at the group of bikers. "I need to know what you're planning." The other riders respectfully moved away, giving them privacy. Garth leaned against his bike, his massive frame somehow less intimidating in the morning light. "We're going to have a conversation with him," Garth explained. "Make him understand that his choices have consequences." Jessie's hands twisted together. "What kind of consequences?" "Nothing permanent." Garth's voice was gentle but firm. "Just enough to make sure he never bothers you again." "I don't want anyone getting hurt," Jessie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even him. I just want this to be over." Garth studied her face for a long moment. "Sometimes, Jessie, people like Tom only understand one language, but I promise you, we won't cross any lines. This ends with him walking away, understanding that you're off limits." "How can you be sure?" Her eyes met his, searching for reassurance. "Because I've dealt with men like him before." Garth's expression softened. "And because I gave you my word that I'd protect you. I don't break my promises." Jessie took a deep breath, looking at the other bikers who stood respectfully distant, then back to Garth. The man who had become her unlikely guardian angel, whose gruff exterior hid a deep well of compassion. "I trust you," she said finally. "I never thought I'd trust anyone again, especially not—" She gestured vaguely at his vest, the patches that marked him as a Hell's Angel. Garth nodded, understanding what she couldn't say. "We'll handle this right, Jessie. By this time tomorrow, you'll be able to walk down the street without looking over your shoulder." The other riders moved back, sensing the conversation was wrapping up. Snake spoke up, his voice gravelly but kind. "Don't worry, little lady. The bear here keeps us in line. We'll make sure this Tom character gets the message without any unnecessary roughness." Jessie managed a small smile, though her eyes still showed her concern. "Just be careful. All of you." Garth straightened up, his presence reassuring. "Everything's going to be fine, Jessie. You have my word." The abandoned warehouse loomed against the darkening sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down at the group gathered below. Garth and his three brothers stood in a loose semicircle, their bikes parked nearby, chrome glinting in the fading light. The autumn wind carried the scent of rain and rust through the empty lot. Tom emerged from behind a stack of old shipping containers, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. His disheveled appearance couldn't hide the dangerous glint in his eyes. 5 against 1? Tom's laugh echoed off the concrete walls. "Seems a bit unfair." Garth stepped forward, his boots crunching on broken glass. "This isn't about fair. It's about you leaving Jessie alone." "You don't understand," Tom said, taking a step closer. His fingers twitched inside his jacket pocket. "She needs me. She just doesn't know it yet." Snake and the others tensed, ready to move at Garth's signal. The air crackled with tension as Tom continued to advance. "Last chance." Garth's voice was deadly calm. "Walk away now. Find someone else to obsess over. Jessie's off limits." Tom's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Or what? You'll beat me up? Kill me? Go ahead." He pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing a switchblade. The blade snapped open with a metallic click. "But I'll never stop. She's mine." "Nobody owns her," Garth growled, his patience wearing thin. He motioned to his brothers, who began to spread out, surrounding Tom. The screech of tires on gravel cut through the tension. Headlights swept across the scene as a familiar scooter pulled into the lot. Jessie jumped off, running toward them before the engine had fully died. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the warehouse walls. "All of you, just stop!" She pushed through the circle of bikers, placing herself between Garth and Tom. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady. "Jessie, get back," Garth warned, reaching for her arm. She shook her head. "No. This has to end, but not like this." Tom's eyes lit up at her presence. "I knew you'd come. You see, we're meant to be together." "No, Tom." Jessie turned to face him fully, squaring her shoulders. "I came to tell you something, and you're going to listen." The knife in Tom's hand wavered. "Jessie, please. I'm not afraid anymore." She cut him off, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not of you. Not of what you might do. I'm done living in fear." Tom took a step toward her, but she stood her ground. Behind her, Garth shifted his weight, ready to intervene. "You can't have me," Jessie continued. "You never could. I'm not your possession, I'm not your destiny, and I'm not your anything. Leave me alone." "You don't mean that," Tom's voice cracked. "You can't mean that." "I do mean it." Jessie's words rang with conviction. "And if you come near me again, I won't need anyone to protect me. I'll call the police myself. I'll stand up in court. I'll tell everyone what you've done." The knife in Tom's hand trembled more violently. His face contorted with a mix of anger and desperation as he took another step forward. The switchblade glinted in the dim light as Tom stepped closer, his face contorted with desperation. "Jessie!" he called out, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "You know we belong together. Stop fighting it." Jessie's heart hammered against her ribs as she emerged from behind a rusty container where she'd been hiding. She hadn't planned to be here, but she'd followed Garth, worried about what might happen. "You'll be mine," Tom continued, waving the knife. "Or I'll make sure you can't be anyone else's." His eyes were wild, unfocused, darting between Jessie and the bikers. Garth's muscles tensed, his leather vest creaking as he prepared to lunge forward. The other bikers spread out, forming a protective circle around Jessie. The air grew thick with tension, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. Jessie's throat felt dry, but something stirred inside her. Months of fear, of looking over her shoulder, of jumping at every shadow. It all crystallized into a single moment of clarity. She raised her hand toward Garth, palm out. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Don't." Garth turned to her, confusion crossing his weathered face. "Jessie, he's got a weapon. Let us handle this." But Jessie shook her head, taking a small step forward. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "No. This has to end. And it has to end my way." Tom's grip on the knife tightened. "That's right, baby. Just you and me. Tell these thugs to leave us alone." "I'm not your baby," Jessie said, her words cutting through the tension like a whip. "I'm not your anything, Tom. I never was, and I never will be." She took another step forward, ignoring Garth's worried grunt. The fear was still there, churning in her stomach, but something else burned brighter. Anger, determination, strength. "If you don't leave right now," she continued, pulling her phone from her pocket, "I'm calling the police. I have evidence of your stalking, your threats, everything. My lawyer has copies, too." Tom's face flickered between rage and uncertainty. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me." Jessie's finger hovered over the keypad. "I'm done being afraid of you, Tom. Done hiding, done running. This ends tonight." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the broken windows and the distant rumble of traffic. Tom's eyes darted between Jessie's face and her phone, his knife hand trembling slightly. Then, like air escaping from a balloon, the fight seemed to drain from him. His shoulders slumped, and the knife lowered to his side. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "No," Jessie said firmly. "I won't." Tom took one step backward, then another. His eyes locked with Jessie's one last time, searching for any sign of weakness. Finding none, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing against the concrete until they faded into silence. Garth and his brothers watched Tom's retreating figure disappear into the gathering darkness. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. They all stood witness to something more powerful than physical strength, the moment when fear lost its grip on a heart that refused to be controlled any longer. Jessie sat in Garth's truck, her hands still trembling as they pulled away from the warehouse. The adrenaline that had given her strength was fading, leaving her feeling hollow and drained. Streetlights flashed across her face as they drove through the quiet town. "You did good back there," Garth said, his deep voice gentle. "Real good. But you need to rest now." Jessie stared out the window, watching the familiar buildings pass by. "I can't rest," she whispered. "Not yet." Her fingers twisted in her lap. "For months I've been letting him control my life. Every move, every decision. It was all about avoiding him, hiding from him." Garth glanced at her, concern etched in the lines of his weathered face. "Nobody would blame you for taking a breather. What happened back there? What happened back there showed me something," Jessie interrupted. She turned to face him. "It showed me I'm stronger than I thought, than he thought, than anyone thought." The truck pulled up outside her apartment building. Garth killed the engine but didn't move to get out. "Listen, kid. I know that feeling. When you finally stand up to someone who's been pushing you down, it feels good, feels powerful, but sometimes that feeling can push you too far, too fast." Jessie shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "This isn't about feeling powerful, Garth. It's about taking my life back." She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts. "I'm calling the police. Right now." "At this hour?" "Yes, at this hour. I'm done waiting." She found the number for the local precinct. "I need to do this while I still have the courage, while it's all still fresh." Garth nodded slowly, understanding filling his eyes. "Want me to come with you?" "Please," Jessie said softly. "I know I need to do this myself, but I'd feel better knowing you're there." They drove to the police station, its fluorescent lights harsh against the dark night sky. Inside, Jessie sat across from a tired-looking officer, recounting every detail of Tom's stalking. She described the letters, the phone calls, the way he followed her. Her voice grew stronger with each word. The officer took notes, asking questions when needed. Garth sat quietly in the corner, a steady presence that helped keep Jessie grounded. When she mentioned the knife at the warehouse, the officer's expression grew more serious. "We'll need statements from witnesses," the officer said, looking at Garth. "You'll get them," Garth replied firmly. The process took hours. Forms to fill out, statements to sign, photographs to take of the threatening letters Jessie had kept. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples. "The temporary restraining order will be in effect immediately," the officer explained, handing Jessie a stack of papers. "The court date for the permanent order is next week. Keep these papers with you at all times." Jessie clutched the documents to her chest. They felt like armor, like shields against the fear that had ruled her life for so long. Walking out of the station, she took a deep breath of the morning air. "You okay?" Garth asked, standing beside her. "No," Jessie admitted, "but I will be." She looked down at the papers in her hands. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Garth nodded solemnly. "Yeah, kid, it is." Morning sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm patterns across the freshly cleaned tables. Jessie hummed softly as she arranged sugar packets in their holders, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time in months, her shoulders weren't tight with tension, and she didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder every few minutes. A regular customer, Mrs. Peterson, watched her from her usual booth. "You seem different today, dear," she said, stirring her coffee. "Lighter somehow." Jessie's smile widened. "I feel lighter," she admitted, pausing at the booth. "Like I can finally breathe again." Through the window, she could see Garth's motorcycle parked across the street. He still kept watch, but it felt different now, more like having a guardian angel than needing a bodyguard. The sight of his bike no longer reminded her of danger. Instead, it brought comfort, like seeing an old friend. As her shift progressed, Jessie found herself actually enjoying the little moments she'd missed while living in fear. The cheerful ring of the bell when customers entered, the satisfaction of serving a perfectly prepared meal, even the simple pleasure of chatting with regulars. During her break, she stepped outside, breathing in the crisp autumn air. Garth was reading a newspaper on his bike, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. He nodded as she approached. "I was thinking," Jessie said, leaning against the building wall. "Would you like to come over for dinner tonight? Nothing fancy, just, as a thank you." Garth folded his newspaper carefully. "You don't owe me anything, kid." "I know," she replied. "That's not why I'm asking. I'd like to cook for a friend." A warm smile cracked through Garth's tough exterior. "Well, when you put it that way." That evening, Jessie's small apartment filled with the aroma of homemade lasagna. She'd opened the windows, letting in the cool evening breeze without fear. The table was set simply but carefully, with 2 plates and a candle in the center. When Garth arrived, he looked almost uncomfortable without his leather vest, wearing a clean flannel shirt instead. He handed her a small pot of flowers, purple violets. "Thought your place could use some color," he mumbled. Over dinner, they talked easily, their conversation flowing naturally. Jessie told him about her dreams of opening her own cafe someday. "I want it to be a place where people feel safe," she explained, twirling pasta on her fork. "Somewhere they can come when they need a moment of peace." Garth nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You'd be good at that. You've got a way of making people feel at ease." "I learned from the best," she said softly. When I first saw you at the diner, I never thought—" She paused, searching for words. "That a rough old biker would end up being your guardian angel?" Garth chuckled. "Something like that." Jessie smiled warmly. "Thank you, Garth. Not just for protecting me, but for showing me I could be strong on my own." Garth set down his fork, his expression serious but gentle. "You always had that strength, Jessie. You just needed someone to remind you of it." He glanced around her apartment, taking in the peaceful atmosphere. "I'm glad I could be there when you needed it." The evening stretched on, comfortable and warm, like a soft blanket on a cold night. Their friendship had evolved into something neither had expected, a bond forged in darkness, but flourishing in the light. The peaceful afternoon shattered when the diner's door burst open, rattling the bell so hard it nearly fell from its mount. Tom stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage, his clothes disheveled. The few customers in the diner fell silent, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Jessie froze behind the counter, coffee pot trembling in her hand. The familiar fear crept back, wrapping around her throat like an icy hand. "You think a piece of paper can stop me?" Tom's voice was low, dangerous. He pulled out the restraining order from his pocket and ripped it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. "You really thought you could do this to me?" Mrs. Peterson stood up from her booth, her phone already in hand. "I'm calling the police," she announced firmly. Tom ignored her, his eyes fixed on Jessie. "We belong together. I've given you chance after chance." He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "But you had to go and ruin everything." Jessie backed away, bumping into the coffee maker. Hot liquid splashed onto her arm, but she barely felt it. Her mind raced through escape routes. The kitchen door, the back entrance, the storage room. "Stay back," she managed to say, but her voice shook. "You're not supposed to be here." Tom's laugh was hollow. "Or what? Your biker friend will come save you?" He reached into his jacket pocket, and Jessie's heart nearly stopped. "I'm done playing nice." The roar of a motorcycle engine cut through the tension. Through the window, Jessie saw Garth dismounting his bike, his expression dark as thunder when he spotted Tom through the glass. 2 more motorcycles pulled up behind him, other members of his gang she'd seen around town. Tom spun around, his hand still in his pocket. "Perfect timing," he snarled. "Now I can deal with both of you." Garth pushed through the door, filling the frame with his imposing presence. His eyes flicked to Jessie, checking she was unharmed, before settling on Tom. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice eerily calm. The other two bikers flanked him, their leather vests bearing the Hell's Angels insignia. One of them spoke into a phone, his voice low but clear. "Yeah, we got him. Corner of 5th and Main." Tom's confidence wavered for the first time. He looked from Garth to his companions, then back to Jessie. "This isn't over," he spat. "Actually, it is," Garth said, taking a step forward. "Boys, let's show our friend here what happens when he breaks the rules." He glanced at Jessie. "Don't worry, we'll handle this properly, legal-like." Jessie saw the flash of movement as Tom tried to bolt, but Garth's companions were faster. They caught him before he reached the door, their grips firm but controlled. Tom struggled, but he was no match for their strength. "The police are already on their way," Garth explained to Jessie, his voice gentler now. "We've been tracking him since he left his house this morning. Knew he might try something stupid." He nodded to his companions. "Take him outside. Keep him there till the cops arrive." As they led Tom away, Jessie's legs finally gave out. She sank onto a nearby stool, her whole body trembling. Garth moved closer, not touching her but offering his solid presence as support. I thought it was over," she whispered. "It will be," Garth promised. "This time for good. We've got evidence of him violating the order, threatening you. He won't be walking away from this one." The evening sun cast long shadows across the diner's parking lot as 3 motorcycles thundered into view. Garth led the pack, his leather vest catching the fading light. Behind him, 2 other Hell's Angels, Big Mike and Johnny, pulled up in formation, their bikes rumbling like distant thunder. Tom stood his ground near the diner's entrance, his hand still inside his jacket. His eyes darted between the bikers, but his stance remained defiant. The parking lot had cleared except for Jessie, who watched from behind her car, her heart pounding against her ribs. Garth dismounted first, his movements deliberate and calm. He removed his riding gloves 1 finger at a time, tucking them into his back pocket. "You made a big mistake coming back here, Tom." His voice carried across the lot, steady and cold. "This is between me and Jessie," Tom snarled, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. Big Mike and Johnny spread out, creating a wide circle around Tom. Their boots crunched on the gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "No," Garth said simply. "It's over." He took a step forward, his shadow stretching toward Tom like a reaching hand. "You had your chances to walk away. Now we do this my way." Tom's hand emerged from his jacket, gripping a small revolver. Several gasps came from the diner's windows, where faces pressed against the glass. But before he could raise it, Big Mike's massive form slammed into him from the side. The gun clattered across the pavement, sliding toward Johnny, who kicked it well out of reach. The fight was brief, but decisive. Tom struggled against Big Mike's grip, but the larger man held him easily. Garth walked over, his face a mask of controlled anger. "You know what happens to men like you?" he asked quietly. "They end up alone, forgotten, wondering why the world turned against them. But it's not the world, Tom. It's you." Red and blue lights suddenly flooded the parking lot as 2 police cars pulled in, sirens silent, but lights flashing. Mrs. Peterson stood in the diner doorway, her phone still in hand, nodding at Jessie. The officers approached cautiously, but Garth and his men stepped back, hands raised. Tom lay on the ground, all fight gone from him. As the police cuffed him, they found the gun and more, a knife, rope, and a crude, hand-drawn map of Jessie's daily routine. "Attempted assault with a deadly weapon, violating a restraining order, stalking..." The officer read out the charges as they led Tom to the patrol car. "You'll be away for a long time." Jessie watched as Tom was placed in the back of the police car, his eyes still fixed on her, even through the window. But this time, she didn't feel fear. Instead, she felt something new. Freedom. After giving their statements, the crowd began to disperse. Big Mike and Johnny mounted their bikes, nodding to Garth before riding off into the growing darkness. Jessie approached Garth, who stood watching the police cars disappear around the corner. "It's really over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Garth turned to her, his stern expression softening. "You can live your life now. No more looking over your shoulder. No more fear." Tears welled up in Jessie's eyes as the full weight of those words hit her. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Garth's waist, hugging him tightly. He stiffened for a moment, then gently returned the embrace, his strong arms providing one last moment of protection before she would step forward into her new, fearless life. The old brick building on Main Street had stood empty for years, its windows dusty and dark. But now, on a crisp autumn morning, warm light spilled onto the sidewalk from freshly cleaned windows. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Safe Harbor Cafe," in gentle blue letters. Inside, Jessie arranged flowers on the counter, her movements calm and purposeful. The cafe was everything she'd dreamed of. Cozy leather armchairs nestled in corners, wooden tables that gleamed under soft lighting, and the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. She'd chosen every detail carefully, from the soothing sage-green walls to the local artwork that made the space feel like home. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a vase of sunflowers, but not from fear, from excitement. The past few months had been a whirlwind of permits, renovations, and late nights planning menus. Through it all, she'd felt stronger with each passing day. The bell above the door chimed softly. Jessie looked up to see Garth ducking through the doorway, his large frame making the entrance seem smaller than it was. He wore his usual leather vest, but his beard was neatly trimmed, and he carried a small potted plant. "Thought you might want this for opening day," he said, placing the peace lily on the counter. "It's supposed to bring good luck." Jessie touched one of the white flowers gently. "It's perfect," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "I've got just the spot for it." She led him to a sunny corner where she'd set up a reading nook. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the comfortable chairs and well-worn books she'd collected. Garth watched as she positioned the plant on a small table. "This place," he said, looking around with appreciation. "It's got your touch all over it." Jessie smiled, remembering the night months ago when she'd first shared her dream with him. They'd been sitting in the diner, and she'd sketched her ideas on a napkin, a cafe where everyone would feel welcome and safe, just as she had felt with him. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said, straightening a stack of menus on the counter. "Not just the cafe, but—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had changed. Garth settled onto one of the bar stools at the counter, his presence as solid and reassuring as ever. "You did all the hard work yourself," he said. "I just stood watch sometimes." Jessie shook her head, knowing it was so much more than that. She poured 2 cups of coffee, her special house blend, and placed one in front of him. Steam curled up between them as they sat in comfortable silence. "Look at us now," she said softly, gazing around her cafe. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and promise. Where there had once been fear, she felt only peace. Where there had been uncertainty, she now stood firm. Garth raised his coffee cup in a small salute. "To Safe Harbor," he said. "To new beginnings," Jessie added, clinking her cup against his. In just an hour, she would open her doors to the public for the first time. But for now, she savored this quiet moment with the unlikely friend who had helped her find her strength. Sunlight streamed through the cafe's windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floors. The morning rush had just ended, leaving behind the pleasant buzz of contentment that Jessie had come to love. Safe Harbor Cafe had been open for 3 months now, and already it had become a sanctuary for many in the community. A young woman sat in the corner, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of chamomile tea. Jessie recognized the look in her eyes, the same haunted expression she'd once worn herself. Earlier that morning, the woman had confided in Jessie about leaving an abusive relationship. Without hesitation, Jessie had given her a card for the women's shelter and domestic violence hotline she kept behind the counter. "Sometimes the first step is just knowing you're not alone," Jessie had told her softly, touching the woman's trembling hand. At another table, an elderly gentleman regularly spent his mornings reading the newspaper. He'd lost his wife recently, and Jessie made sure to bring him his coffee just the way he liked it, black with 2 sugars, along with a few minutes of conversation that helped break up his lonely days. The cafe's success wasn't measured in dollars and cents, though business was steady. Instead, Jessie found fulfillment in the small moments. The grateful smiles, the quiet conversations, the way people's shoulders relaxed as soon as they walked through the door. She'd created more than just a cafe. She'd built a haven where people could feel safe and understood. Every morning, Jessie arrived early to bake fresh muffins and scones. The routine brought her peace, and as she worked, she often reflected on how far she'd come. The fear that had once consumed her had transformed into strength, and now she used that strength to help others find their way through dark times. Her small staff had become like family. They shared her vision of making the cafe more than just another coffee shop. Many of them had their own stories of overcoming adversity, and together they'd created an atmosphere of genuine warmth and understanding. The bell above the door chimed, and Jessie looked up to see Garth's familiar figure. He'd been away on a long ride with his club, and seeing him brought a smile to her face. Without a word, she reached for his usual mug, the oversized one with a chip in the handle that he'd claimed as his own. She poured him a cup of the dark roast she kept brewing especially for him, and carried it to his regular spot at the counter. Their eyes met, and in that moment, no words were needed. They both understood how this place and their friendship had grown into something neither of them had expected. Jessie leaned against the counter, sipping her own coffee, sharing comfortable silence with the man who had helped her find her courage. Through the windows, she could see the street coming alive with morning traffic, people hurrying to and fro. But here in Safe Harbor, time moved at its own peaceful pace. The quiet between them held years of understanding, hard-won trust, and the kind of friendship that didn't need constant words to prove its worth. They'd both come so far from that frightening night when she'd first asked him for help, and yet in many ways, their journey together was just beginning. A small smile played at the corners of Jessie's mouth as she topped off Garth's coffee. The warmth of the morning sun, the gentle murmur of conversations around them, and the rich aroma of coffee created a perfect moment of contentment. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Jessie looked up to see Garth's imposing figure filling the doorway. His leather vest caught the afternoon light, the patches and pins telling their own stories of a life lived rough but true. He'd been coming by every few days, usually during the quiet hours between lunch and dinner. "Your usual?" Jessie asked, already reaching for his favorite mug, a sturdy ceramic one with a chip on the rim that he seemed to prefer. Garth nodded, settling into what had become his regular spot at the counter. "Place is looking good," he said, his deep voice carrying warmth that few people got to hear. His eyes swept over the cafe, taking in the fresh flowers on each table and the local artwork hanging on the walls. As Jessie prepared his coffee, black with just a hint of sugar, she noticed how different things felt now. The fear that had once consumed her life had faded into a distant memory. She watched Garth pull out a newspaper from his back pocket, unfolding it with careful movements that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Had someone come in earlier?" Jessie said softly, sliding his coffee across the counter. "Reminded me of myself, you know. Before." Garth looked up, his eyes understanding. "You helped them?" "I did what you did for me," she replied. "Showed them they weren't alone." A comfortable silence fell between them as Garth sipped his coffee. Jessie moved around the cafe, straightening chairs and wiping tables, but her thoughts drifted to how far she'd come. The woman who had once been too scared to walk home alone now owned her own business, helped others, and had found strength she never knew she possessed. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the windows, Garth helped her close up. It had become something of a routine, him staying until the last customer left, then helping with the chairs and checking the locks. Not because she needed protection anymore, but because that's what friends did. "Jenny called today," Garth mentioned as he flipped the chairs onto the last table. "The woman you helped last week? She made it to the shelter." Jessie smiled, feeling a wave of relief. "Good. That's really good." They worked in companionable silence, moving through the familiar closing routine. Garth's presence had become as much a part of the cafe as the sound of coffee grinding or the smell of fresh-baked muffins. He'd changed too, she noticed. The hard edges were still there, but they'd softened somehow. He smiled more, spoke more, lived more. As they finished up, Jessie found herself drawn to the large front window. The street outside was quiet, peaceful in the golden evening light. She remembered how she used to fear these moments, when day turned to night and shadows grew long. Now she felt only tranquility. Garth moved to stand beside her, his reflection appearing next to hers in the window glass. Neither spoke for a long moment, both lost in their own thoughts. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding and shared experience. In their own ways, they had saved each other, Garth by being her protector when she needed one most, and Jessie by showing him that life could still hold beauty and purpose after loss. They stood together at the window, watching the day fade into evening, two unlikely friends who had found healing in their shared journey. The cafe had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of their triumph over fear and isolation, a testament to the power of human connection. The late afternoon sun streamed through the cafe's windows, casting warm shadows across the worn wooden floors. Jessie wiped down the counter with slow, deliberate movements, her mind drifting to the journey that had brought her here. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, a comforting reminder of how far she'd come. She paused, her hand resting on the counter where just months ago she'd been a terrified waitress in a different diner. The memory of Tom's threatening presence made her shiver, but it no longer held the same power over her. Instead, she felt strength surge through her, the kind of strength that comes from facing your fears and emerging victorious. Garth sat at his usual spot, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. His presence had become a constant comfort, like an anchor in stormy seas. She watched him chat quietly with another regular customer, his gruff exterior softened by the gentle way he listened to the elderly woman's stories about her grandchildren. "Would you believe it?" she said softly to herself, straightening the display of pastries. A year ago, the idea of trusting a hell's angel, or anyone for that matter, would have seemed impossible. But Garth had shown her that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. The betrayal of her former coworker still stung when she thought about it, but even that had taught her something valuable. Trust, she'd learned, wasn't about never being hurt. It was about choosing to remain open despite the risks. She'd seen both the worst and best in people through this ordeal. As she moved through her cafe, greeting customers and refreshing coffee cups, Jessie felt the familiar surge of pride. Each table, each chair, each carefully chosen decoration represented a piece of her dream come true. But more than that, they represented her victory over fear. This wasn't just a business, it was a testament to her resilience. The afternoon crowd began filtering in, filling the cafe with cheerful chatter. Jessie worked with practiced efficiency, but her movements were relaxed now, confident. Gone was the constant looking over her shoulder, the flutter of panic at every sudden movement. In its place was a steady assurance that she could handle whatever came her way. She caught her reflection in the gleaming coffee machine. The same woman, but different somehow. Her eyes were clearer, her shoulders straighter. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had come in small moments of courage, in choosing to stand up for herself, in learning to accept help when she needed it. Love had come in unexpected forms, too. Not just romantic love, but the love of community, of friendship, of self-worth rediscovered. Her regulars had become like family, each bringing their own stories and struggles to share over cups of steaming coffee. She'd learned to listen as others had listened to her, to offer the same kind of support that had helped her through her darkest days. Behind the counter, Jessie moved with purpose, her hands sure and steady as she crafted lattes and plated pastries. The cafe hummed with life around her, exactly as she'd always dreamed it would. Each satisfied smile, each thank you, each return customer was a reminder that she'd not only survived, but thrived. Her cafe had become more than just a safe haven for herself. It was a warm, welcoming space for others who might be fighting their own battles. She understood now that triumph wasn't just about overcoming fear, it was about creating something meaningful from the experience. The familiar bell above the door chimed as more customers entered, and Jessie looked up with a genuine smile, ready to welcome them into her space. She had her life back, but it was more than that. She had built something new, something entirely her own. The evening sun painted the cafe walls in shades of amber and gold as the last customers trickled out. Jessie moved between the tables, gathering empty cups and plates, while Garth sat at the counter, his usual coffee growing cold. The cafe had become their sanctuary, a place where both of their broken pieces had slowly mended. "I still can't believe how different everything is now," Jessie said, stacking chairs onto tables. Her movements were confident, nothing like the frightened woman she'd been just months ago. "Sometimes I wake up and have to remind myself that I'm safe." Garth nodded, his weathered face softening. "You did that yourself, Jessie. You found your strength." "But I wouldn't have without you." She set down her cleaning cloth and leaned against the counter. "You showed up exactly when I needed someone most." "Just returning a kindness to the world," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "Sometimes that's all we can do." Jessie studied the man who'd become her protector and friend. His leather vest hung over the back of his chair, the Hell's Angels patch catching the light. Who would have thought that her salvation would come in the form of a burly biker with a heart of gold? "I've been thinking about expanding," she said, gesturing to the cafe around them. "Maybe opening a second location across town. Somewhere else people can feel safe." Garth's eyes crinkled with pride. "You've come a long way from that night outside the diner." "I was so scared then," Jessie admitted, remembering the paralyzing fear that had gripped her. "But you taught me that being afraid doesn't mean you're weak. It's what you do with that fear that matters." "You taught me something too," Garth said, standing up. "After losing my family, I thought closing myself off was the only way to survive. But you showed me that helping others, it helps heal those old wounds." Jessie felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes. She walked around the counter and wrapped her arms around the big man's waist. After a moment's hesitation, he returned the hug, his presence as solid and reassuring as always. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," she whispered. "You already have," he replied, stepping back. "Every time you open these doors without fear, every time you face the world on your own terms, that's all the thanks I need." They finished closing up in comfortable silence, falling into the routine they'd established over the past months. When everything was clean and put away, they stepped out into the cool night air. Jessie locked the door, the familiar click of the deadbolt no longer filling her with dread. "You're going to be just fine," Garth said, shrugging on his leather vest. "I know," Jessie replied, and for the first time she truly believed it. "Will you stop by tomorrow?" "Wouldn't miss my morning coffee," he said with a small smile. Jessie watched as Garth walked away, his broad shoulders disappearing into the darkness. A profound sense of peace settled over her as she stood there, the night no longer holding the terrors it once did. She had faced her demons and won, and though the world could still be a frightening place, she knew now that she had the strength to handle whatever came her way. She touched the cafe's window, her reflection overlaying the darkened interior. In it, she saw not the frightened waitress she'd once been, but a woman who had learned to stand tall in the face of fear. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.